Hello, everyone. My name is David Schulman. I'm director of the Global China Hub here at the Atlantic Council, and I'm pleased to welcome you to our event today on investigating the domestic drivers of China's foreign policy in 2022. The Global China Hub is the newest center here at the Atlantic Council, and one of our central areas of focus is how domestic political and economic developments inside China affect China's foreign policy and shape the impact that China has on the global economy, on security, and on international institutions. It's always critical to have a strong grasp on China's, or really any country's, domestic affairs to properly understand its external behavior and to engage in the difficult business of forecasting policies and their effects. But I'd argue that this is particularly the case with China in 2022. Chinese leaders' approach to a range of internal matters, from COVID to its tech sector, to income equality, to the run-up to the all-important 20th Party Congress later this year, have potentially massive external implications for everything from global growth to the course of an increasingly fraught US-China relationship. And we're all watching to see how China pulls off the Winter Olympics in just a couple weeks amidst the lockdown of tens of millions in line with China's zero COVID policy and a diplomatic boycott in reaction to China's ongoing rights abuses against its Uyghur population. So we've got a lot to get to today. Fortunately, we have a truly fantastic panel of experts to discuss this wide-ranging topic. Before I introduce them, let me just note for our audience that we do hope to have time to take questions. So please insert any questions that you may have throughout the program into the chat function, and we'll do our best to get to them later on. So with that, let me turn to introductions. We have Joanna Chu, is a senior journalist for the Toronto Star, Canada's largest newspaper, and the author of China Unbound, A New World Disorder. Joanna previously served as bureau chief of the Star Vancouver and was previously based for 7 years in Beijing and in Hong Kong as a foreign correspondent, including for the AFP. Michael Schumann is a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub and an author and journalist with more than 25 years of experience in Asia. He is currently a contributor to The Atlantic and a columnist for Bloomberg Opinion. He was previously a foreign correspondent for the Wall Street Journal and Time Magazine, and his most recent book is Superpower Interrupted: The Chinese History of the World. Next, Professor Steve Song is director of the SOAS, School of Oriental and African Studies, China Institute at the University of London. Steve has written numerous books on a wide range of topics, including Chinese history, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Chinese politics and foreign policy. And we have as well Lingling Wei, who is the chief China correspondent for the Wall Street Journal and co-author of the book Superpower Showdown. She covers China's political economy for the journal, focusing on the intersection of business and politics, and has won many awards for her China coverage. And in 2021, she's among a team of reporters and editors whose work was a Pulitzer Prize finalist. So welcome to all of you. We have really a great panel here, and I'd like to kick things off with a question for Steve about this big event toward the end of the year, the 20th Party Congress, that's likely to color much of Chinese leadership thinking throughout 2022. So with Xi Jinping presumably looking to secure a third term at the Party Congress, and he and other leaders predictably focused on demonstrating firm leadership over the country's direction and success in advancing China's global interests in this politically sensitive year, what sort of foreign policy do you expect from Beijing? And do you think that Chinese leaders will seek stability in external relations, especially with the United States, or will they be even more driven to respond strongly to perceived slights?
Well, thank you very much, David, and thank you also for inviting me. To respond to your questions, I think it kind of implies that there is a bit of a this or that. Will China be more assertive, or whether China will be focusing much more on stability? My take is that the Chinese government does not see the two as a zero-sum choices. In fact, they will do both. I think you are absolutely right to highlight that 2022 is going to be a particularly important year in terms of Chinese domestic politics and foreign policy. This is the year that Xi Jinping expects to get his third term, and therefore the beginning of unlimited terms of office. I mean, once he gets a third term, there's nothing to stop him getting a fourth and a fifth and a sixth. So it is important, and he will try to make sure nothing will happen that can pose any problem for his own assertions to the third term. Now, having said all that, then Xi Jinping is the man who is delivering the China dream of national rejuvenation. He is the man who is going to make China great again. He is not, therefore, a leader who will, in the run-ups to his third term, tolerate and stand for any foreign government or foreign individual or institution being disrespectful of China in any way. Being disrespectful to China in the year of 2022 is being disrespectful to Xi Jinping. And that is something that cannot possibly be tolerated. And I think we also have to acknowledge something that we would like not to be true, which is that wolf warrior diplomacy, as we call it, is something that Xi Jinping supports and endorse and will not back off from. I mean, we may see the wolf warrior diplomacy as being aggressive, unwise, unjustified, or perhaps even counterproductive. It doesn't look that way from Beijing's perspective, in particular from Xi Jinping's perspective. And that's why we have not seen one single wolf warrior, whether one is talking about diplomats or journalists in China, who has been punished for standing up for China's dignity. So I think we can expect, and I think we have to expect, that the Chinese government sees righteousness in the wolf warrior diplomacy and will continue to do so. Who will dare to tell Xi Jinping that wolf warrior diplomacy is counterproductive? I mean, we also have to acknowledge that if Xi Jinping gets his third term, which is the default option, really, and if he gets that, there is not going to be anybody within the establishment who will question or challenge any policy decisions he has made. And for foreign policy, it really stops with Xi Jinping. And who amongst the senior government leaders would dare to tell Xi Jinping the truth? So I think we can end, I'll end by simply reaffirming that we need to expect China to take I think in their way of seeing it, a firm and righteous foreign policy, which essentially means that it is going to be very assertive and, from our perspective, a bit aggressive. But the only place where we can be confident of not the worst outcome is perhaps Taiwan. I don't expect China to use force against Taiwan this year. That's too much of a risk to take. I'll stop here and hand it back to you.
Thank you, Steve. That was great. And I think we'll come back to Taiwan hopefully a little bit later. But I think the point that we won't see Xi standing for any disrespect for China and that there's no indication that he's going to pull back wolf warrior anytime soon is a really important one. And it relates to another aspect of this question around China's external behavior, particularly its response to external criticism and drive to shape global discourse that I want to ask Joanna about. So over the past 2 years, we've seen China more aggressively seek to influence policies and narratives in foreign countries, including through disinformation on global social media, economic coercion, the harassment of critics, among other methods. So how do you see Beijing's foreign influence efforts evolving during this sensitive year, given what Steve just said, given the fact that Chinese leaders are attuned to criticism of China's human rights practices this year, perceived violations of the One China policy, and also with the US and other countries considering the adoption of tough legislation on China?
Yeah, that's a great question. And thanks again for having me on this panel with these esteemed panelists. Like, all of their books are amazing. I'm in the middle of quite a few of them. So for my book, China Unbound, that was basically what I tried to answer. I tried to look at how Beijing's, the party states and Chinese policing works around the world to try to influence certain populations. So, I'm sure people in the audience already know this, but the way United Front and secret policing works in China is that there's a combination of kind of carrot and stick techniques where for some people, such as often politicians, there's techniques like flattery, political donations, inviting people on these all expense paid VIP trips to China. And what I tried to point out in my reporting, both for my newspaper here in Canada, Canada is such a hotspot for a lot of these activities, is that the targets aren't the high profile you would expect. There are high profile targets in Canada. Our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, he was, a few years ago in this fundraising scandal where he didn't declare that he met with a group of allegedly Chinese state affiliated funders who paid a lot to meet him. And these pictures ended up basically being used in sort of soft domestic propaganda back in China. So there are, high level targets, but I posted a link to one of my stories. Prime targets, the last one are Canada's local politicians a target. So what I expect that, these lower level forms of foreign influence will continue to happen because they've been going on for decades, basically undetected. I was looking for it and I found these instances, but really, it's not really spoken about all around the world. And my book really tries to do these case studies around the world to see, how different societies are kind of dealing with these issues. But there's a slow realization that, so for example, in BC, close to Vancouver, but 10 hours north, so really cold. You can imagine it's kind of like ranching country, right? So people expect that they're small town politicians. They don't expect to kind of be part of geopolitics. But, that's not how the style of Chinese foreign influence works. They basically think that I found like from country to country, that there's basically no one that's too small potatoes, low level. In fact, people who are lower level politicians are in fact prime targets because they have control over things like land use rights, education partnerships in their jurisdictions, and they're great targets to become potentially friends of China. So you can click that link for more details on how that works all around the world. And I expect that to continue because there's so little pushback. I spoke with, government and police, bodies here, and basically there's no training for politicians to be aware of this. There's no training for police. There's no legislation or any type of infrastructure to look at these kind of low level, very widespread forms because they're not illegal. It's just a matter of people not realizing the scale and the resources that Beijing has and how much it cares about its image around the world to trying to get these friends around the world. I think what the key message is that at least people need to be aware. It might not necessarily be an issue where you criminalize these activities, but having politicians feel like it's not in their wheelhouse is an issue. And then there's the other side of the coin, which is the targeting, the intimidation and threats of people around the world. Again, I think people didn't realize this was happening. The mainstream didn't realize because mostly the targets were people like me, people like my family, immigrants from China and Hong Kong, members of the diaspora that Beijing particularly wants to control and feel like to shore up loyalty amongst, feeling worried that Chinese Canadians, Chinese Australians, Chinese Americans, because of our language, our cultural ties to China, might have disproportionate potential impact on potentially destabilizing the Chinese population. So the second link I posted in the chat is about a Chinese student who came to Canada in Quebec. He had 2 followers on Twitter, and he was just experimenting with tweeting, including about a satirical video about Xi Jinping. And he was so shocked that Chinese police contacted him over WeChat and basically threatened the safety of his family back home in China if he didn't delete his account. And as a law student in Canada, he knew his rights in Canada were perfectly, he was able to be on Twitter. But it's an interesting dynamic where there's so much leverage, and this has happened more and more. And recently it's happened more to foreign researchers, foreign journalists, where you have these kind of amorphous death threats. BBC journalist John Severith had to basically flee China because he was worried about his family's safety. So I argue that these things have become more better known in recent years because the targets now are no longer like nameless students, international students of Chinese descent. They're no longer just immigrants of Chinese descent. There are people like Michael Covert and Michael Spavor who were detained as hostages in the Wanzhou, whole mess. So unfortunately, I think there's Western complicity because when targets are now more high profile, meaning in some cases they're white men, suddenly more people are concerned. So looking forward, just to wrap up, when it comes to things like hostage taking diplomacy, in some cases, people argue that in the case of the two Michaels, when they went for people that were more high profile who had no link, family link to China, in some ways it did work because Meng Wanzhou, she was able to strike a deal to return home. And as far as economic coercion, I think that might be, we could discuss further. But in the case of Australia, all signs point to economic coercion not being as effective as perhaps the Chinese government wanted. Trade flows were pretty robust even during a pandemic. But my worry and why I profiled more economically struggling economies in my book, like Greece and Italy, is that might not necessarily be the case for less economically robust countries, that they would be able to adapt to things like tariffs that Australia and Canada, US have received. So I think these things will continue. And I think it's already, in some ways, because like Steve said, the nationalist part of the Chinese state seems to be quite dominant. Even though, a lot of people would see things like hostage taking diplomacy as a failure, kicking out journalists from China as a failure, as PR failure. I think some parts of the CCP that are very loud right now might actually see them as successes. So that's where you worry that these things will continue.
Thank you, John. And I think, your book, to state the obvious, really has added a lot to, I think, the literature and the understanding of these dynamics about the party's interference and influence tactics, certainly in Canada, but even, further afield. And I think you're right. There's a greater understanding and attention to what's happening in terms of interference in policies and politics in places like Australia and just this last week in the UK and other places. But also now finally some growing attention to what's been happening for a very long time, as you said, with attempted coercion in diaspora communities around the world. So thank you for that. So I want to transition now to an area that I think many people primarily focus on when they think of internal dynamics in China, which is, how will those dynamics affect the bottom line for their country or their company? And so Ling, I want to turn to you and ask, we had news just this last week reinforcing that growth is slowing in China. The property sector's troubles are deepening, and China's persistence in maintaining a zero COVID policy has many worried about effects on global supply chains. So I'm curious about your take on those dynamics and how you view the likely effects on global markets and supply chains, but also on just more broadly on China's outbound investment and financing, including possibly the BRI in the year and in the years ahead.
Sure. Thank you very much for the invite and great questions, Dave. Before I really get to address this question, I wanted to just make a few comments on Steve's presentation earlier, basically your question about China's policy toward the US. So, I really think I completely agree with Steve that, China's policy will remain very assertive and aggressive. I think, for the near term, the coming year, Xi really is focusing his US strategy on damage control rather than actively trying to reset the relationship. So that basically means that, the Chinese leader, whose top priority is ensure a very smooth transition to the next term, is willing to, he's going to willing to work with President Biden to reopen channels of communication and, basically preventing any kind of conflict. Beyond that, China has really very little motivation to compromise or negotiate or any of the core issues that are at the heart of the strained bilateral relationship, from human rights, territorial disputes to China's own economic practices. So I just wanted to add that one little bit to Steve's excellent presentation. In terms of questions you asked, exactly, you laid out those problems very well. China's economy is facing some very serious challenges this year. And, some of that really is Beijing's own making. A sharp slowdown, I think, will definitely hurt China's global ambitions, especially the Belt and Road Initiative. As we know that the Belt Road Initiative has been a main channel for Beijing to expand China's influence under President Xi Jinping, its importance has grown as the US and other developed countries really have been curbing China's money flowing into their countries. So I think there's a very good report from American Enterprise Institute just this week. They had some latest data on money, how much China spent through the BRI program over the past year. So basically, in 2020, as we know, that Chinese investment in construction overseas really plunged because of the pandemic. But that kind of investment recovered mildly last year, mainly through the Belt and Road Initiative. So I think, this initiative still very much important for Xi Jinping and important for China in terms of its effort to become more influential overseas. One thing I want to point out is that even before the current slowdown, China really has been struggling with this new role as the largest lender to the developing world. I think there's some very good research from Rhodium Group that shows as many as $1 in every $4 extended by China through overseas lending has come under renegotiation, as much as $94 billion. So, on one hand, you're seeing that for the first time ever, China is working with multilateral organizations like G20 as a creditor, to try to work out debt relief plan for nations like Zambia. Asian diplomat I spoke to last year was telling me that China really wants to be a responsible and benevolent stakeholder, at a time when Beijing really is trying to compete with Washington for global leadership. Then on the other hand, you're seeing Chinese officials, the Chinese banks, they're really resisting plans, such as those put forward by the World Bank, urging the Chinese lenders to forgive hundreds of billions of dollars of debt. They're saying, okay, we're not state lenders, we're commercial lenders. So you're seeing that they're really struggling. On one hand, they want to uphold and increase their role as a global power. On the other hand, they're struggling with another objective that we're still a developing country. Another reality, we're still a developing country. They can't really afford to forgive all those debts that are coming due. So, another thing that is factoring into their consideration is that China really wants to make smarter loans as the as domestic economy slows, as we just talked about earlier. So I think they're really trying to recalibrate its overseas lending to limit and better rationalize flows. However, I do think the whole program, the Belt and Road Initiative, is here to stay. It's not going to end just because how much the economy is slowing domestically, and how many loans China have made in past years are going bad. They're recalibrating the strategy. They're trying to make smarter loans, and then they still see this program as very important for Beijing to compete with US globally. So I'll end my remark here. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Langley. I think those were really comprehensive comments, and especially on the, how China's approaching debt forgiveness and kind of, aligning with the G20's debt sustainability initiative. But I think you make a very important point that our one of the fellows at the Atlantic Council in our Geoeconomics Center, Jeremy Mark, has also made about the fact that this doesn't extend to the policy banks like China Development Bank, and what that means, because they are often the holders of the loans for most countries in the global South that have taken credit from China. So it's a really critical point. So let's turn now. I think it's interesting, even as growth slows in China, as Langley was laying out, we have Chinese leaders undertaking new initiatives to still reshape aspects of China's economy and society for a variety of reasons, not necessarily related to the needs for short-term growth. So I want to turn to Michael and ask, Xi Jinping has articulated this newfound commitment to common prosperity, which, you've written about this. It's a vague concept around the reduction of income inequality, which is now at the top of the government's economic agenda. So I want to ask, how much of a push do you expect to see on this front in 2022? And what are the implications that you see both for China's role in the global economy, China's own economy, and also its efforts to promote China's governance model around the world this year and also, beyond?
Yeah. Thanks, David. Well, common prosperity, in theory, is actually a pretty good idea for the Chinese economy. I mean, if income inequality is a problem, and if the government is able to introduce policies that will distribute the benefits of Chinese growth and development more evenly and more widely, then maybe we'll finally see this kind of long-awaited and long overdue shift in the Chinese growth model towards greater reliance on domestic consumption, which is very important for China going forward. But as they say, the devil's in the details. So whether or not common prosperity actually has a beneficial effect will depend on how it's actually implemented, and that's where things get kind of very fuzzy. I mean, there's been a lot of very interesting ideas that have been floated around, including by Xi Jinping himself. Things like tax reform, supporting small companies, more rural development. This is all really interesting stuff. But how and when this is actually going to become real policy is really not clear. And what we've seen common prosperity look like so far is kind of more of a populist political campaign to kind of beat up on some big companies and rich people, and take action against certain sectors like the private education sector. I think you're also seeing it influence the Chinese government's policy towards the property sector right now. The idea that the property prices have to come down, and the way the sector works has to change. But however it actually kind of plays out on the ground, I think it actually is going to become a factor in Chinese foreign policy. When the idea of common prosperity already kind of dovetails really nicely into themes that the Chinese government is already promoting in its propaganda about itself. I think it can factor into the campaign to promote China as a superior economic model and a superior form of governance to, for example, what the United States has. This is already a big part of Chinese media and Chinese propaganda, the idea that China is a more just society. And you see it in elements of their diplomatic initiatives, like the Belt and Road Initiative, which is sold as a form of cooperative development, spreading prosperity. China as the poor kid who made it big and is now wants to kind of give back and spread the wealth and do it in a cooperative fashion. In real life, of course, none of that is actually true. And you look at economic statistics, the Chinese economy is not necessarily a more just and fair place. Despite obviously the tremendous poverty alleviation that's gone on there and the increase of wealth, China's income distribution is not significantly better than it is in the United States, and worse than it is in most European countries. And I think we know by now that Belt and Road is really more of a campaign to promote Chinese business and political interests around the world than it is a kind of a true kind of multilateral development program. But why let some inconvenient facts get in the way of a good propaganda campaign? So I think common prosperity, I think, is going to become one of those terms that you see the Chinese leadership use again and again in their messaging and their speeches to try to differentiate China, its economic model and its form of governance from what you see in the US and other democracies, as a way of making the case that China is a better model and a more fair and a more just model based on a more fair and more just society. The idea that, we here in China, we care about the little guy and, and we really want to make things better, and we really want to bring real results to our people compared to, what's going on in the United States. So I think you're going to see common prosperity as an issue both at home and abroad continue to kind of be center stage in China through 2022.
Great, thank you, Michael. The point about Chinese leaders potentially using common prosperity as part of all the other things they're doing to try to promote China's model abroad and kind of portray China's rise and the community of common destiny and the China dream. China's rise benefits all, and China taking a leadership role on climate and a whole host of other kind of global challenges. In the last year and a half, really since COVID, or 2 years, we've seen China kind of look a little bit more insular, right? And so the question, there's been kind of in that context, there's been a discussion about, do we expect that to persist, or does this indicate some sort of change in the way that China is approaching its external behavior and effort to kind of be a leader on some of these issues? So in that context, I kind of want to ask the panel and shift to kind of opening this up. We have the zero COVID policy in particular in the spotlight right now as China deals with the effects of Omicron. And so I'm curious whether folks see Beijing maintaining this policy through 2022, or perhaps pulling back a bit and otherwise maintaining some sort of restrictive entry rules. And if so, do you think that this contributes to a more insular China through 2022 with effects potentially on its foreign policy and global engagement? And kind of related to this, and you can, answer however, to whatever part of this you like, particularly given we have 3 journalists on the panel here who've spent years reporting in China, what's the effect of diminished information coming into and out of China with these COVID restrictions, combined with lack of media access and China's further crackdown on Chinese people's access to information? What is the impact of all that for mutual understanding between China and the outside world, and potentially for misperceptions in the US-China relationship in particular? So I'll just kind of open that up to whoever wants to jump in. Steve, go ahead.
Well, I think when we are looking at Xi Jinping's approach to foreign policy and generally all policies, he is a China first person. He is Sino-centric in his basic approach. It doesn't mean China does not want to claim global leadership. I think China does want to claim global leadership, but China is not looking to replace the United States. China is looking to do it in a way which is much more different from how the Americans have been doing it as the unipolar power post-Cold War. Because being number one carries a lot of baggage and a lot of global obligations. China has no intention of doing them. So the closing of the borders because of COVID, because of the zero COVID policy, is something that will be continued because it is a policy Xi Jinping has laid down, and he simply will not allow this to be shown as a failure in the run-up to the 20th Party Congress. So that will continue anyway. But the question really is, will it continue beyond that? Does the Chinese government under Xi Jinping worry about cutting China off a bit? I think what we see is China under Xi Jinping wants to engage with the rest of the world on China's terms, not on the terms that we want China to engage with us. And there's not a huge amount that we can do to change how they think about it and approach it and implement this. Back to you.
Yeah, I agree with that. Any other thoughts on that? I think related to this question of kind of information access was a question we had from the audience as well, which was more kind of specific to the next few weeks, but how will China handle foreign press during the Winter Olympics? But, that's just kind of part of this broader question of information. But Michael, it looks like you want to say something. Go ahead.
Yeah, I've been thinking about the interplay again, what you were talking about earlier, David, about the interplay between domestic and factors and foreign policy. And I think the zero COVID policy has kind of factored into that. Remember this, getting back to this idea of China increasingly promoting itself as a superior governance model. Its battle with COVID has been very much a part of that messaging now for the last 2 years. Ever since China was successful in early 2020, kind of squashing its own pandemic in a relatively quick period of time, this success has been very much at the center of its messaging to the world that we can achieve great things. Our system can achieve these great things better than those democracies. Look at what a mess those democracies are in dealing with COVID. And in some cases, this messaging actually became somewhat, I'd say, kind of somewhat nasty, where you found kind of Chinese officials and Chinese media kind of mocking the struggles of other countries and the sufferings of other people compared to what they have done, and basically trying to paint their own methods and governance as superior. I think we have to think about how this may have boxed them in on a certain level in continuing to pursue a zero COVID policy at home. Since you've been telling the world that your ability to control COVID is a mark of the superiority of your system, it's very difficult to then kind of undo that policy and allow for a much, let's say, more widespread outbreak, because then suddenly you kind of look like everybody else, and you're starting to have the problems of everybody else, and it shows that your system was not able to defeat the virus and sustain these policies either. And honestly, I don't think much of the rest of the world would necessarily see it that way. I think the rest of the world is questioning how much longer can China sustain the policies that it has in place and keep its borders closed and keep putting its people into lockdowns and disrupting the economy, especially with the economy slowing. But I think for the Chinese leadership, I think this would be seen as something of an embarrassment on the international stage, or it would show it would be kind of it would be seen as a political failing on their part. And so I think this has created, in my opinion, some policy inflexibility for Chinese leadership in dealing with COVID domestically, and perhaps starting to move on from this very strict COVID policy that is obviously had a lot of beneficial effect, but is also starting to have some detrimental effects too.
I would just add quickly I would just add quickly that it also goes both ways as far as capacity to understand and access China. The US in 2020 suspended its Fulbright programs, and that was, met with a lot of protests by Americans who the Fulbright program was how they got their start as researchers, as journalists in China. They were able to spend a year working on research and learning Mandarin in China. And also dozens of Confucius Institutes have closed in American universities, which, in a way it's positive because there's all the questions about Confucius Institutes being compromised and as an avenue for influence, but they're not being replaced by university Mandarin language or Cantonese language programs. They're not being replaced by other, Asian studies, China studies programs. So I think I worry that because of this lack of resources on understanding, traveling to doing research on China, learning Chinese, which is such a basic to understanding China in a very more holistic way. We end up in a point where, because also all these foreign journalists are getting kicked out or can't go to China or Hong Kong, you get a more like surface level and distance view of China, and in that way, more simplistic narratives, possibly more xenophobic narratives could become more dominant, especially in the US. So I think that's also an issue. You have to look at what the US is doing, what Western governments are doing to shore up the availability of knowledge and just learning about China for people who are interested in studying.
I think that's a really important point and relates to the question of, some politicians in the US and others calling for more restrictions on for instance, Chinese students or workers or researchers coming to the United States. Ling, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I just wanted to add one quick point based on very excellent point made by Joanna. It's really interesting. So when you talk to policymakers in the US or, read about the remarks and, how they view the US approach to China, you often hear that, okay, years of engagement with China, that strategy has failed, right? Because China still is China, and nothing has changed about China's political system. I really do think that's a misconception. Joanna made the point that, in the past, there's still so many exchange programs, right, between the US and China, students, American students going to China and vice versa. That really worked. There are so many Chinese learned about American way of living and way of life, through those exchange programs, through the opportunities that, for them to come to the States to study, myself being one. And for the government in China, there still is this deep-seated fear about so-called peaceful revolution. That just shows, the year's engagement didn't really fail. It really, affected generations of how Chinese people think about the world and what kind of life they desire. Recently, I'm sure you all paid attention to the sixth plenum, the very big party event that was concluded in November, when the party released its third historical resolution, the big, document about, basically that affirmed the party's leadership and Xi's leadership. Very little about history, by the way. But they still talk about how the party should protect itself from foreign influence. That just shows they're still worried about influence of foreign ideas, Western kind of democracy. So cutting off those exchange programs, it's really not doing anybody any favor here. It's just making China in a way, a little bit more isolated. And you guys just talked about how the access for foreign journalists, being in China, becoming increasingly, limited. It's really the truth. So, without this is the day and age where we kind of need more windows into China, not fewer. So if we don't have American journalists on the ground in China, and we don't have more channels of exchange with the Chinese people, then the Chinese understanding of how the rest of the world works is getting increasingly limited. And the the Western conceptions, Western perceptions of China, public opinions of China also have changed dramatically, and sometimes also not exactly accurate. So that only contributes to deepening misunderstanding and deepening distrust on both sides. It's really not a very good future we're looking at here.
I think those are all very important points, and kind of leads to a next question, which I want to kind of put to all of you in terms of what U.S. policy or UK policy or Canadian policy ought to be towards China in this sensitive year, given the kinds of dynamics we've just been talking about in terms of lack of communication and awareness and diminishing rising misperceptions. So what should be prioritized in these policies this year? Where are the greatest opportunities potentially for allied coordination on China policy, and also where are the greatest risks? So any thoughts on where we ought to be going in terms of China policy? Steve, go ahead.
I'm happy to jump in first again. I think Ling Ling is absolutely right that we must continue to engage with China. I am not naive. I am perfectly well aware that the current trajectory is the result of both sides pulling. It's not one side. The Chinese are closing themselves up more as well. But they can afford to do that. We can't. We want to engage with China in order to make sure that there is better dialogue, better understanding, and less risk of us, both sides on current trajectory, heading towards some place that nobody wants. But I think what we also need to do, and this is much more important, is that we do have to get our own house in order. The narrative coming out of Beijing that the Chinese system is superior has leaks in China because our democracies are doing so badly at the moment. I mean, you have your Trump era, which has not really been put into history entirely. We over here in the UK still has Boris Johnson hanging on to power, damaging national interests in the way that we would expect it to happen more regularly in a Leninist system than in a democratic system. So we really are not doing very well. We have to get our own house in order. We also have to coordinate and engage with China, holding our own values and principles high, but on a basis where we can justifiably do so, rather than simply saying that we are democratic, we are human rights loving, we obey rules of law and everything, and then have a prime minister coming up and say, oh, we just signed an agreement with the EU, we can repudiate on that. Or an American president coming and says things pretty similar. We are not going to get anywhere engaging with China on those terms. Sorry, went on too long.
Any other thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think we have to be prepared for the possibility. I agree with Steve completely. I think we have to be prepared for the possibility that the Chinese leadership is just at a certain point right now, or at a certain stage, where they're not necessarily interested in engaging or cooperating with the United States and its allies. I think that they may on some very big picture issues like climate change, but in regard to the bilateral issues and other issues that are really at the heart of deteriorating relations right now, there's a lot of indications for what we've seen just in Chinese foreign policy and the way they've interacted with lots of different countries that they're not necessarily interested in compromising. And as Steve said, that we've seen deteriorating relations because there's been, issues on both sides. And until the Beijing government is willing to kind of accept more responsibility for its role, and it's the souring of relations with Washington and other countries, I don't really see us getting very, very far. And when you look at the way Chinese foreign policy has been directed recently, it's to a great degree about compliance. It's about making other countries change their policies to suit China's interests, whether it's been very obvious with Australia. We see it going on with Lithuania right now, is happening with Canada. And, even the United States, during the meeting that Wendy Sherman had with her counterparts in Tianjin last year, she would basically handed a list of demands and say, okay, when you guys do this, come back to us. So the leadership seems to be in the mindset that they don't necessarily need to compromise and cooperate on issues where they don't feel it's in their interest, and that they're growing powerful enough and they have enough levers of influence that eventually everybody is simply going to have to kind of concede to what they want. That's I think maybe a bit of a simplification. They might be willing to do kind of small deals here and there and continue talking, of course. And I think they are interested in having consistent dialogue at least. But in terms of actually getting anything done and resolving real issues, I'm concerned that the leadership is just not in the right and it doesn't have the right attitude towards the U.S. and the right attitude towards its place in the world and its relations with the world right now.
I agree with that. And I think particularly this year, it will be, I think we would be overly optimistic to think that Chinese leaders would do anything that appears to be engagement that gives anything to the United States. That's going to be a common factor, I think, going forward, but especially in the months ahead. I think we'll turn to, I have a audience question on that asks about what's happening with Russia and Ukraine, that asks, with Russia as a Chinese partner, how does China see its role in tensions that are ongoing in Eastern Europe? But I might kind of, in line with my promise to come back to Taiwan, kind of tie this to the broader question of, whether Russia will invade Ukraine and what the US and NATO response will be. What kind of lessons, and I'm sure you've all gotten this question in the last couple of weeks, what kind of lessons China is learning from this situation and what it might mean for its thinking about coercive and military options regarding Taiwan, as well as potentially its maritime disputes in the South China Sea. So I want to pose that question to all of you. How should we think about the lessons China might learn from the Russia-Ukraine situation? And then back to our topic today, how do any such lessons balance against the many other factors unique to how Chinese leaders think about Taiwan in particular, and its relevance to the narrative that the party wants to present to the Chinese people, particularly in this sensitive year? So, and any thoughts on that general topic? Steve, go ahead.
Well, I think you're absolutely right to highlight that from the Chinese perspective, looking at Ukraine, they are looking at it with Taiwan in mind. I don't think the Chinese are really themselves particularly keen that a war break out in Europe. But if the Russians should invade, and if for all that has been said by the US administration, not much is being done. That is a very powerful message to the Chinese government, that all that economic devastations that Biden promised Putin on Russia, if that doesn't materialize, why should they worry about American threats of retaliation over Taiwan? Now, I think they are not naive. They do understand that there isn't an American law requiring the United States administration to come to the defense of Ukraine, as there is a Taiwan Relations Act over Taiwan. And therefore, they do see a bit of a difference. They do realize that Russia and Ukraine share a land border. China has to go over 100 miles of very treacherous waters to get to Taiwan. So they are not quite the same thing. But the messaging and the calculation, I think, would be very important, because Ukraine is still a very significant change to the geopolitics of a very important part of American global strategy from the Chinese perspective.
Ling, go ahead.
Yeah.
I think, oh, sorry.
No, I'm sorry, that was my fault. Yeah.
Ling, go ahead, and then Michael.
Oh, okay. I just wanted to add to what Steve just said. Eventual reunification with Taiwan is really essential to Xi Jinping's China dream, which basically means he wants a unified China, strong economically, militarily, and that give Chinese people a sense of enormous pride. So the question is, when would that happen? In what way should that happen? Obviously, there have been some very worrying signs in the past few months that China might do something imminently, right? Starting from last year, increased military incursions around the Taiwan Strait, and also government is kind of stepping up this call for food security, energy security. You see the Commerce Ministry late last year urging local authorities to stockpile food, and all that, made it seem as if China were already on war footing. But I think that within the leadership, I don't think there's a consensus in terms of the time frame and the approach yet. As we all know, that the chances of basically very big that Xi Jinping will secure another term. I think probably 15 more years. That means probably 3 more terms. But that's a question. How many years he stay in power? That's the time frame for when China will eventually, take actions to bring back Taiwan. And in terms of what approach, what kind of strategy should Beijing use? That's another thing that's still being debated. I think they're realistic enough that the one country, two system approach is no longer going to work for Taiwan based on what happened in Hong Kong. But exactly how can China take Taiwan back? Exactly what approach they should take, that's still very much under debate. But for sure, as Steve and Michael mentioned earlier, the relation Taiwan is really one of the biggest flashpoints, right now, in terms of the relationship between U.S. and China. Some of the people you talk to in China might tell you these days that, had it not be because of U.S., basically standing in the way, China would have had Taiwan back already.
Right. Michael?
Yeah, what I'm worried about is more that Beijing may learn the wrong lessons from what goes on with Russia and Ukraine, or misinterpret what goes on. American interests in Europe and in Eastern are obviously very, very important, but I think it would be wrong to assume that an American response to military action against Taiwan would be the same as the response to Russian aggression against Ukraine. I think you can argue that the U.S. has different interests with Taiwan and Asia, and arguably you could make a very good case that Taiwan's fate is much more core to American national interests than what happens in Ukraine. I'm sure there's lots of people in Europe who would feel probably differently about that. But looking at it from kind of a cold calculation, so on basis, you can make a case that there's a lot more on the line for the U.S. with Taiwan. And what worries me is that you have a leadership in Beijing that I think is becoming convinced that the U.S. is a power in decline, and if things in Ukraine kind of work out in Putin's favor somehow, then that's just going to kind of reinforce this narrative that I think is taking hold in Beijing, that America's time has passed, and then that could kind of factor into their thinking about what their future actions should be with Taiwan, and that could lead to kind of dangerous miscalculations as well. So that I actually, that my main concern is that Xi Jinping takes away the wrong signals from what goes on in Eastern Europe.
Well, unfortunately, we are at time. So I want to thank our fantastic panel. We covered a lot of topics with amazing depth, given we only had 1 hour, and that's a credit to the four of you. So thank you very much. I want to thank our audience, and I look forward to seeing all of you again soon at one of the Council's many upcoming events on China. And just for your awareness, just next week on the 26th, we'll be hosting a book launch for non-resident senior fellow Jonathan Fulton's new edited handbook on China-Middle East relations. So we hope to see you then. So thanks again to the panel, and I hope everyone has a nice rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.